Dealing with transparency in After Effects comes in different flavors depending on where the transparency was created and for what purpose. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of how transparency can be imported into After Effects. So the first one that we're going to look at is what you're looking at in this composition. We have a file which is a PNG image that is on top of all these other images. Now, that file itself, as you can see, has been selected, and as you can see, my transparency, my pasteboard for that file, or the size of the actual file, goes all the way to out here. But this whole area here is transparent. All of that is transparency. Let me switch quickly to Photoshop so you can see what I am talking about. This file was created as a layer, and in that layer I have the visual of the logo of the San Francisco MoMA, and everything else is transparent. So if I were to create something and place it as a layer underneath it, I would see it here. That is transparency that has been applied to that particular layer. As you saw in After Effects, that transparency is respected. So you can create that type of transparency in programs like Photoshop and bring it into After Effects so that you make use of that transparency. Another way to create transparency from programs like Photoshop is to actually save alpha channels. So for example, in this case, we have this small image, and in this image, we see that everything seems to be flattened. As a matter of fact, I see the image is flattened out here into the background. But when I go to the Channels tab in Photoshop, I notice that I not only have an RGB channels of information, but I also have an alpha channel information. So if I turn that on and I turn these off, you'll notice that I have alpha channel information that has been applied to this file. This is a TIFF file. TIFF files and PSD files can save that alpha channel information as a separate channel besides your RGB channels. Now to create this, you actually use your masking tools, and then you can save that selection as an alpha channel. This information is very important because it allows us to maintain anything that is light in color as visible, meaning anything that you see within the white area will be something that you see when imported into After Effects, and everything that is dark or black will be semi-transparent on the gray areas and completely transparent in the black areas. So you can make use of that light and dark information to create alpha channel information that you can use to your advantage when you bring stuff into After Effects. Meaning, keep in mind that it is the lightness and the darkness values that determine what is visible or invisible within the files that you're applying the alpha, or that you're using for alpha channels. This also applies to colors. So if the color is bright, then it would be visible. If it's a dark color, then it would be transparent if you were to use colors instead of black and white information for that alpha channel. However, most commonly, not most commonly, the actual standard for using alpha channel information is to use black and white images. In this case, that's the information that has been saved in that channel. And so let me turn this back on, turn off the alpha channel on that file. And let me go ahead and import that file into After Effects. So let's go ahead and import that file. I'm going to go into that file right there, boom. And it's going to tell me, okay, this has an alpha channel attached to it, as you saw in Photoshop. So I don't know how it was created. I don't remember how it was created, or even if I knew, I would just simply click guess, and it would guess the best possible setup between pre-multiplied and straight formats. Remember, I explained this a couple of modules ago, where straight unmatted means it just keeps the transparency information as it was created in Photoshop, and pre-multiplied is asking for a color to which it can blend into in the background. So if I don't know, but I do have an image, a background image that is an even color, and I want my best blend possible, then I might be able to choose that color to matte it out so that my transparency sort of gray, it kind of feathers into that background. And that might be the option when you have a color that, if you don't know how it was created and you want to pre-multiply it, that would be the option you have to select the color that's in the background that is the most prominent color, and then your transparency will blend nicely into that background. But when you don't know, like I said before, simply click guess and the program will do it for you. So we'll click OK on this, and there is my spaceman. Now, when I drop this image into the composition, you will notice that I see in those areas where I had transparency in that Photoshop file. So if I look at this, let me actually zoom in. And by the way, I am zooming in by using my middle mouse wheel, so I am just simply rolling up. You see that I see transparency values in the glass dome of that spaceship, as you can see. Just like I see the transparency values of the logo that we had as a layer in Photoshop. So all that information has been saved from that program and brought into this program. That is alpha information. So that's the key to the first point of transparency information is, what can I do with that alpha information? Well, right now, the alpha information by default is being used in order to create transparency so I can see what I created in those other programs and everything else is transparent. However, the alpha information is attached to the files. So let me delete that Spaceman layer really quick. I'll select it and hit the delete key on the keyboard. Let me fit to 100%. And let me show you what can be done with that transparency information. So for example, let's go ahead and make use of the alpha information in this file to see through to something that's behind it. We did this when we were working in modes. So if I went to that particular layer, and from the modes menu, if you don't have the modes available to you, look down on your, let's hide this for a second. You will see this switch at the bottom. So if you click on that, you will switch between modes and switches. But if you want to keep it open at all times, simply right click on the gray area and open up the columns, drop down and choose mode. So that you will maintain it open. Now over here, I had the option, this is what we did when we were talking about modes a couple of modules ago, where I could just choose stencil alpha. And basically what that mode is going to do is going to use the alpha information, meaning whatever I have that is visible, as a cookie cutter to everything that's behind it. So if I click on that, everything that's behind it becomes the content for that logo, and everything else becomes transparent. The drawback of having this setup is that it's cutting right through everything. And so if I were to place another image, let's say, for example, I grab this image and I want to place it behind everything else, you won't see it anywhere because that cookie cutter is cutting through everything. And in order to not have it cut through everything, but only through selected items or selected areas, we don't use stencil alpha. To be quite honest, I never use this. I mean, I would say I have used it probably once in the past 15 years. So I don't use this format. I use a different format, which we will see in our next video. It's called track matting, but we will talk about that in the next video. For now, know that the transparency that you bring in, I brought that layer to normal again. And notice that basically it's using that transparency information. Now, that information is fine. So you have the transparency information that you had created in other programs. And some of you might have a more versatile way of working in those programs that will allow you to create more focused or better targeted masks. That's one way to create masks. The other way of creating masks in After Effects is by actually using the masking tools inside After Effects. So even though that layer already has transparency set on it, you could actually apply more masking onto that particular layer. And as a matter of fact, in After Effects, you can create as many masks as you want within one layer. So, for example, let's say I want to, let me turn this off for just a second, and I only want to see this area here of this image, only that area right here. So if I only wanted to see that area, then I'll select that layer, which is this water side. And to create a mask for it, with the layer selected, this is important, make sure that you have the layer selected. You can now use these tools up here, the rectangular tools or any tool inside that drop-down menu. So if you long press that tool, you will see that you have options for creating different shapes. Now, these shapes, because you have the layer selected, the program has tagged that layer as if I interact with this thing, I am going to be drawing a mask. And what does that mean? Well, let's start with the standard rectangular mask. So I'm going to draw a shape on that layer, and as you can see, I have created a mask in that layer that allows me to only see the area that I wanted to focus on. You will notice also that under that layer over here, I now have a new property called masks, and it already created one mask for me. I can, if I want to rename that mask, I can select it and hit the return key or the enter key on the keyboard, and I can name it whatever I want to name it if I want to give it a specific name. For now, I'm just going to keep it as mask 1. One of the things, though, that you need to understand about this masking is that the mask is attached to the layer. Now, your layer still goes all the way up here. The layer artwork is still all the way out there. It's just the mask that is reducing the visibility of it. The beauty of this masking through After Effects, let me uncollapse that mask menu for it, is that the mask itself has its own properties, some of which are extremely useful. So for example, if I want to create a reveal from this mask, say, for example, that is opening up from top and bottom, then I could animate that through the mask path options. I can also feather the masking itself. As you can see, when I increase the masking, it's creating a feathering effect around the mask. Let me deselect by clicking on the gray area here, so you can see how it created a nice feather all around the image based on the mask. Let me reset that back to 0. And notice that they are constrained. So if you change one, you change the other, but you can always uncheck that and only affect the feathering in either horizontal, which is the first number, or vertical, which is the other number. You also can change the mask opacity. So you can create opacity changes based on masking instead of having to use the opacity changes based on the actual layer itself. So you can do that as well. And you can expand. Even though you've selected a specific area with the mask, you can actually expand beyond the mask or below the mask. So you can actually expand that dynamically. Notice that all of these properties have stopwatches, which means you have the ability to create keyframes. So any of this can be animated through time. Let me undo that last step so that I reset that. And let's say for the last thing that I want to show you is the mask path, which is the most useful for us. So for example, if I want to make a reveal of that mask, I can always double click the mask, and you'll notice that when I select the mask, I see the handles around the mask turn into that transparent gray thing. Let me deselect everything, select the layer again. Then to access that mask, I'll double click it. And if I double click it, I have access to it. Now, if I click on one of the handles, if I double click on one of the handles, I now have access to the actual mask. Notice that it turned yellow. That is the color of that mask. If I change the color of the mask, let's say, for example, to red, notice that that mask color changes. And every new mask will have its own color to identify it so that you can actually see what you are selecting. So once again, let me click on the gray area here to deselect everything. Select the layer. Now I have the layer selected. I'll go ahead and double click the mask, and that selects the entire mask, and I can animate this. So for example, with the handles already selected at this stage, I'm gonna keyframe this, the very beginning of this composition, mask path, and then I'm gonna go down to about, say, 20 frames. So at 20 frames, I'm gonna double click that mask again to select it, and then I'm gonna move this guy down, and I'm gonna do that motion by pressing Control. As I am moving the handle on the mask to decrease its size, I'm pressing Control on the keyboard so that both ends move proportionally, top and bottom. So I am closing this out like this. Now you'll notice that when I go back, the mask is open and then it gets animated to close. Now, that's, say, for example, I wanted that to be a reveal, not a close. Well, I can, now that I have it done, I can select those two keyframes, right-click them, Keyframe Assistant, and Time Reverse Keyframes. That means my last keyframe moved to the beginning, my first keyframe moved to the back, and now I have a reveal. So that's how you would create an animation that does that. Let's preview that really quick. And as you can see, it basically creates a nice reveal. Not only can you do that, let me remove all these keyframes to reset. You can also animate the mask itself. So for example, I mean, this is animated, as you can see, it changed in scale value, but you can actually change the position of the mask. So for example, let's set a mask path value here with the very first keyframe. Now let me go back to 20 again, and then I'm gonna double click the mask to select the entire mask. So when you see those gray handles and the anchor points on the corners, that means that you have selected the entire mask. Okay, you haven't selected a specific point, you selected the entire mask. Notice that when you roll over inside the mask, your mouse changes to that black arrow, which is your selection tool. So that means that if I click and move, I am actually moving the entire mask. So that creates a new keyframe because that was the mask path shape that I changed. And when I play it back, I can see that my mask is moving upwards. So you have that ability to actually create the animation of masking. This gets really interesting when you actually do something a little bit more creative. So let's go ahead and delete that mask. And to delete a mask, by the way, you can select the mask itself on the masks drop down, the mask that you want to delete, select it, and hit the delete key on the keyboard, and the mask goes away. Notice that the artwork remains. Now let's go ahead and go to this layer here, the forest. So on the forest layer, let me actually bring it up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create kind of like a blob that is going to be dropping down. So what does that mean? Well, instead of using one of the shapes that's given to me in the program, I am going to draw my own shape. And you do that by using the pen tool, just like you would create a path in Photoshop, or you would create a vector path, sorry, in Illustrator. So if you know how to do that, basically it works the exact same way here. Let me use the pen tool here. And you also have other tools under the pen tool, by the way, just like you do in Illustrator. So I want to select the pen tool with the layer selected, forest. I am going to start drawing a mask. You'll notice that in my cursor, I have a little shape that looks like a box with a little dot in the center. That indicates that I am on mask creation mode. The reason for that is because these tools also allow you to create shapes within After Effects. We will be talking about shapes in our next module. But note that the tools can also create vector-based shapes that live within After Effects. So it's something that is extremely useful, and we're going to be talking about that in the next module. For now, know that in order to create the masks, as I said a few minutes ago, you need to make sure that you have selected the layer that you're working on, and then choose the tool and then start working. Look out for that shape next to your cursor that indicates to you, oh, okay, I am in the actual masking mode. So I'm going to start drawing here. I'm going to click, 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 and then I'm going to close that shape. You will notice now that I created kind of like a blah shape. It's a non-shape shape. It's organic. But you'll notice that it has handles. Just like the corners on that mask had handles, this one also has handles. So let's go ahead and create some, let me uncollapse that, the forest to reveal its masks. There is my mask 1. And I'm going to open up the mask path. So I'm going to create a keyframe for that at the beginning. Then I'm going to go to frame 20. And then what I'm going to do at this point is what I did before. I am going to double click on one of the points on the mask. Now that selects the entire mask, as you saw with the rectangle. I can move the mask at this point, and it creates a new keyframe, and I see the mask in motion, which is great. Let me undo that really quick. What would be really cool is if I can reshape the actual mask, and we can. So how do you do that? Well, let me deselect everything to start again from scratch. So I'll select the mask itself over here, and I am going to double click it. There it is, to select the entire mask. Then I'm going to double click one of the points on the mask. Deselect by clicking elsewhere, and you'll notice that they get circular, and now I have access to them independently. So it's kind of a tricky set of steps, but fairly easy to follow. The first thing you do is double click to make sure that you're in the mask, that you're actually selecting the mask. Then double click one of the points so that it is the entire mask that is selected. Now, if I move it, I'm moving the entire mask. But if I want to make each point separate, then I can click on the gray area somewhere. Notice that they turn round, which means now they're editable. So if I click on one of them, I have access to the Bezier handles that come with the mask, and I can go ahead and manipulate each point independently. That creates a new keyframe, as you can see on my timeline. And that means that I am animating each point independently, even though I only have one keyframe. So even though there's only one keyframe, all of the points have been animated. And when I play this back, you will notice that the mask morphs in shape, which is extremely cool because you can actually modify your masks to whatever shape you want. So that masking gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, another way, if you found it difficult to remember the steps that I showed you a second ago to access the points on the mask, there's yet another way to do this. Let me go to 40. And then I'm going to simply deselect everything by clicking on the gray area here or here on the pasteboard somewhere. And so I'm going to select the forest layer. I'm going to select the mask. And then what I want to do at this point, notice that the anchor points are square, meaning if I click on one, I'm going to be moving everything. And that's not what I want. Well, you have the other tools that you can work with. So remember these tools, the pen tool, add points, which is at vertex. In this case, it would be the add anchor points in Illustrator. You can delete anchor points, or you can convert anchor points or vertex points. They're called vertices, which is the way we call things in 3D space. So when you're talking about an anchor point in Illustrator, you're talking about vertices in 3D programs or in After Effects. So to do that, let me convert that vertex tool. If I click on that tool, notice that I can click and it automatically turns that point into a Bezier point. And I can go ahead and modify the shape of the point. You'll notice that with the tool, I am selecting the point, but I am not able to move the point. Here is where using shortcuts comes in handy. If I press the V key, V as in Victor, you will notice that I switch my tool to the selection tool. So now I can click and modify each point independently. Okay, so it is extremely useful to use those shortcuts. If you want to go back to the feather tool, to the pen tool, simply press the P key on the keyboard. Sorry, not the P key. So, go ahead and press the G key on the keyboard, and you will have access to the actual tool, going back to the pen tool, or simply click it from the drop down. And so now you have access to that by simply clicking on it. Now let me deselect by clicking on the gray area, going back to select the actual forest picture, and open up its mask. There it is. By the way, the shortcut to open up the mask is the letter M. M as in mother. And now you can go ahead and click on any of the points and morph as you wish. And notice that the animation is created for you by creating a new keyframe. So you have the ability to manipulate these masks even if you use a standard mask. Now you can have more than one mask like I said before. So let me, for example, now that I have this mask set up over here, I'm going to use the same image, same layer. I'm going to use now the rectangle tool, and I'm going to create another mask on top of that other mask. And you'll notice that now my two masks have different colors. I have two masks on my timeline, and you'll notice that this mask, the rectangle, has handles as well, just like the anchor points that you see here. So to access those, I can go ahead and double click to select that mask, click on the gray area somewhere, double click it again, click on the gray area, and now I have access to each point independently. So I followed the same process that I showed you before. So you can manipulate these things over time as well. Let's say, for example, I want to start with that shape, and I want to apply a keyframe to it, and then at this point, I want to bring that whole thing up this way. So now I have the interaction of two masks. But what if that's not what I want? I only want to see the area where they meet. Well, you'll notice that as soon as I add any masks, I also have options for each mask on this drop-down menu, where by default, they're all into add mode, which means any mask that you add onto this showcase whatever is inside that mask, meaning keep on adding. But you can always subtract if you want to, and you only have whatever that is outside of that mask. Let me put this one to add and do subtract to this one. So that takes out the chunk of area that has been selected by that mask. Now let's say intersect. That gives us a really cool effect. If you notice, now I have the two masks creating very specific shapes in the area where they intersect. So this concept here is similar, if not the same, as when you're using Pathfinder tools in Illustrator, or when you're using Boolean operations in 3D programs. Basically, you are combining the shapes by selecting what you want to do versus another. Or you can always invert a mask. You can always select, I want an inversion of that mask, and it's only selecting. Let me turn off the second mask. I'm going to have add onto it, and you'll notice that the mask for the blob has been inverted. If I invert this one, same process. It only masks everything that is inside, and then everything that's outside will be visible. So you have a way of actually reworking a lot of visibility within those transparencies by manipulating the set of masks and how they interact with each other, which is an extremely helpful way of working, and it doesn't force you to have to think the masking process when you are in programs such as Photoshop or Illustrator, as you are pre-producing materials to bring into After Effects.